Well, another Monday is here, and I wanted to tell you guys some stuff I hadn't thought about talking about before. I think I'm going to revisit a slide or two that we've talked about before, and I'm going to plow into this thing. I've got a few pictures and stories and stuff to tell you, so here, let's jump into this thing here. The 10th digit on the serial number, ever since about 1980, has told you what year model the vehicle was, and it doesn't matter who makes the vehicle. It's something that you're going to have to learn. Well, it's easier to learn it, you know, and you can train yourself with using little memory bugs or everything. Like, you might notice the way this thing is set up. If you've got, let's see, for example, P on the older ones was 93, right? P was 93. V, I remember that because a sideways V looks like a 7. You know, and then you could start counting with A being 1980 and B. But notice what happens in 2001. Now, you're all remember, we did not use I, O, Q, U, or Z. Those are the ones. I, O, Q, U, or Z were not used. Didn't use any of those. We used every other letter. And then we went into numbers in 2001. And then we basically went on back to letters in 2010. So the thing about it is, if you see a B on a 2011, you're not going to mistake that for an 81 model. So there's plenty of time in between there. But I printed this and I posted it on the door, and I had my students come up with memory bugs so they could kind of figure out on the same way as this goes. You know, if you look at P is going to be 2023. You know, right now we're in this area right here in the early 2020s. But if you can do that, there was a time when I used to be able to walk to the write-up area and I would look at the serial number on a vehicle from under the windshield, and I would be able to walk back to the service desk and write down that entire 17-digit serial number without forgetting a single digit. And I got to where I was pretty good at that. But you can train your memory to do stuff like this. That's the point, okay? And so here you are. If you break those numbers up like into 4 or 5 digit words, you know, you're basically like remembering several words instead of having to remember each separate letter and all that. It works anyway. And so that's the way that was. Now this right here was on a brand new radiator we got for a Sonata. And whenever, you know, they gave you this, they put these fittings on the radiator, and they gave you some fittings that you were supposed to use that came with the radiator, some nuts, you know, some flare nuts. And so whenever you go to put those on there, if somebody didn't use the fittings that came with the radiator and the student didn't use them, he wipes out the threads on the new radiator. Well, that just ruined that. But that brass is really soft anyway, and it's really easy to mess that up. Well, once you've made this happen, you know, if you've got a good rapport with the parts store, I guess, you know, you can get them to talk you into giving you another one and all that. But the simple fact is, this is a kind of an expensive mistake, you know. Because sometimes it's a parts store. If you don't buy a lot of stuff from the parts store and you take it back, you know, they might not want to give you the money back depending on the parts person. But most of the time the parts guy, he ain't got no dog in that hunt anyway, and so he'll just go ahead and take it back and say it was a defect and all. But that was something that I ran into. I went and did some teaching over there earlier last summer, and we had to replace the radiator on one of the trainer cars, and this was what happened. Well, on that same vehicle, we have these rotted tires. You know, this is really nasty stuff to see tires that are in this bad of shape. The thing about it is, even if they're not rotted like this, they can still throw the tread off. Remember the rule on the tires, they go out of warranty at 6 years. Some of the tire manufacturers claim they're still safe for another 4 years after that, but I don't really like that. My wife's pickup truck has got tires on it that are Michelin's, that were same tires that came on it when it was new, but that truck is coming up on 6 years old, and we're going to wind up having to replace those tires, I imagine, because I don't really like to take a chance like that. One of the reasons that they started requiring the tire pressure monitor system was because some of the vehicles were running low air pressure on the tires, and they were throwing tread off, and it was, you know, some of the SUVs that'll roll the thing over and kill people. But something else that happens with tires is if you've got something like a Chrysler Crossfire, it's got factory tires on it that are low profile, or any low profile tire, whether it's OEM or not, if you're driving that thing low on air for a while, I mean where the sidewall is really being bent, and then you try to air the thing up, you're going to wind up in a situation where your the sidewall of the tire blows out. We had that. The lady pulled in there on her Chrysler Crossfire and said, "Hey, can you put some air in my left rear tire," or whatever. But she had driven it a long way. As soon as we started putting air in there, well, before we even got 40 pounds in it, or 30 or whatever it was, it blew the sidewall out. And of course, she wanted to try to blame that on us. But I showed her. I said, "Look, these low profile tires aren't like to what they used to be." So that's another little tire thing. I actually bought one of these Superchips devices, and I loaded my Explorer with this Superchips Mileage booster. Now whenever I tested my gas mileage, I was consistently on the highway on this Explorer. It's an 06 model, and it was getting like 24 was as good as it would ever get. Try as I might, drive with a steady foot on the road, I could not get over about 24 miles to the gallon. After I did this, they said, and they were realistic about it, they said that this would bump your gas mileage up about 7%. And so you notice the little warning here, and they're even telling you whenever they do this reflash. The cool thing about Superchips is it saves your original programming. So on that particular controller, you can go back to your original programming if you don't like what this is doing. And there's a lot of different choices you got on this Superchips thing. And it basically comes in this box right here, basically. I've got my thing sitting on blur in the background, so it's giving me a hard time. But anyway, it's a cool little thing, and I bought it. It cost a few $100s, which doesn't really hurt anything, All right, so I put that in there. I got 7% increase. It was fairly easy to do. You just follow the instructions on the screen, do it exactly the way they say, and you'll turn out okay on that one. Now, the evaporator replacement, I remember I had a leak on my Explorer, my AC leak. Okay, so I had this AC leak on the Explorer, and on the Explorer, I wound up having to have the evaporator replaced. Now, I could have done that, but I didn't want to do it in the yard or the driveway and all that. But whenever Ford sends the evaporator, they send the whole housing, like you see right here, which is pretty interesting to me. All right, so what happened was the evaporator drain on these Explorers is not visible. Like sometimes you'll have a little piece of pipe, you can just look up there and see it. Well, this one here, the way they got it draining, it just sort of drains all up under the middle of the vehicle and everything. And so I suspected the evaporator was the problem. And so I took it in there and I said, "Jimmy, troubleshoot this, put it up on the lift, do whatever you have to do." And he ran it for about a half a day with dye in it, and he saw the dye dripping out from under it. And so I went ahead and paid them to put an evaporator in it, because they're my buddies up there at the Ford place anyway. And the guy that does it is really, really, really fast. And Jimmy didn't do it, but there's another guy that's been up there a long time that's a really good mechanic, and I had him do it. And I was willing to pay to have it done because I needed my air, and my air conditioner hadn't needed any more refrigerant since then. I found another couple of leaks on it, but none of them were the one that was causing it to go low on juice. And it got to the point of where it was going low on juice every few days. And that gets kind of expensive if you're paying like $8 or $10 a can at Walmart for refrigerant and having to put it in there. And so that solved that problem. And it was worth it, to me, because I like to have my air, All right, now these burned out plugs, I wanted to revisit this. I've talked about this before. But what happened with these burned out plugs was this girl's brother had a 4-cylinder 89 or 90 model Ranger, the one with the 2 plugs per cylinder. And they've got on those Rangers with the 2 plugs per cylinder, they got the coil pack. They got 2 coil packs, 2 4-cylinder coil packs, and they've got those things set up. Now when you're starting one of those Rangers, they've got a strategy called DPI, called dual plug inhibit. So that whenever you're first spinning it over to start it, the only spark plugs that are firing are the ones on the passenger side bank. And then after it fires up, all the plugs are firing together. But these 2 plugs here came out of the same cylinder. And she said my brother, his pickup started skipping, and he went ahead and replaced the spark plugs, and he found these 2 spark plugs looking like this. And this was the ones that he first pulled out. And he says, but he has put new spark plugs in here, and they look exactly the same as these now after only driving it for 4 or 5 days. And he didn't put that many miles on it. I had seen this before at the Ford dealer on an F-150 that had a 5.8 in it. And what happened was it came in skipping, and the plug was burned up just like this. And Philip, the guy that was, this guy named, that was working over with him named Philip, he actually did a compression test because when he replaced the plug, it came back a couple of days later with the plugs burned out the same way as these. You see how they're just total, look like you held a torch to them. Okay, so he says, I noticed the compression on that number 5 cylinder, the front one on the driver's side bank, is about 125 psi, and all the other cylinders are bouncing around between 155 and 170, and this one's low. And so they decided to go ahead and do a valve job on it. And so they pull the heads off, and sure enough, the intake valve was leaking on that cylinder, and it was letting air in there that didn't belong. And on one of these fuel injected engines, when you're letting that air in there, that extra oxygen is making a big ugly fire that's super hot, and it just cooks those spark plugs. And haven't seen that time before, and there's a little bit more to that story too, that I'll tell you in just a minute. But that girl came in and I says, if your brother wants to fix that, he's going to need to do a valve job on that vehicle most likely, because it's letting air in there. And she told me later he pulled the head off, and sure enough, the cylinder that these were in, had a burnt intake valve. Wasn't leaking really bad enough to lower the compression a lot, but it was letting enough of that fresh oxygen in there when it didn't belong, where it was like pulling the trigger on a torch after you got something red hot. It was just making that cylinder run super hot. Now, back to the 5.8 at the Ford dealer, we had received this machine, this fuel injector cleaning machine. It was an aluminum thing, got a pump in it, the tank and all that. And you'd mix this injector cleaning juice in there, this Motorcraft stuff, and when you poured it in there, it's made the gas smell like ammonia, which really amazed me how that was. And I said, and this was the same vehicle the guy had found the low compression. They found the valve, like it was burnt, and they did a valve job on the heads, put them all back together. It was still skipping on that same cylinder, on that cylinder number 5. And so the shop foreman had the mechanic. I didn't even know the mechanic was working. I had 25 mechanics in the shop. I didn't know he was the one that was working on that. He just walked up here and says, hey, can you test this injector? And so I had that machine, and actually there was a machine that you could hook that machine up. There was a function on the machine, had a flow meter, and it had little colored bands, and this was the one that was, the orange injectors on the Fords in those days were 19 pound per hour injectors, and the blue ones, if I remember, were 14 pound per hour. I'm sorry, the gray ones were 14 pounds per hour. And so there was little bands on that flow meter, so you could flow test that injector and tell if it was flowing in the band it was supposed to be flowing in. But early on, whenever we got that machine, and I should have covered this with the shop foreman, but I didn't, because I was the only one using the machine, and I used it to clean injectors. And he said, so I put some power and ground to it. I had a little thing I'd plug into the injector and hook it up to the battery, and whenever I would do that, I would spray carburetor spray through it just briefly enough to see how it would spray, and then I would stop, and then I would unplug the electric from it and spray the carburetor spray again if it didn't leak through. I had to hold it down there really close and tight on the tip of on the end of the injector. I said, well, I don't see anything wrong with this. It looks to me like it's spraying fuel. So they put the injector back in there. This was a lack of communication between me and the shop foreman. He should have been full transparent and said, look, this one Philip looked at is still skipping. We took it to the land mechanic. He did a valve job. It's still skipping on the same cylinder. We need you to see if you can find out why. He didn't do that. And he actually had to do a whole bunch more work on that thing. Finally, they gave up on it. He brought it to me and said, see if you can make this quit skipping. I just cleaned the injectors. Took care of the skip. And I kind of thought it was funny, but the shop foreman got really ignited about it. And he says, this machine was supposed to tell me that. And I said, look, I've seen the machine where I would test all the injectors and they would flow like they were supposed to. And I would clean the injectors, they'd flow the same way, but the vehicle ran better. I don't trust a test that I can't trust. If it's not a go, no-go test, I'm going to discard that because it's too much trouble to hook all this stuff up. whenever it's not even going to tell you the truth to begin with. And that was one of the things that we had to deal with right there. But anyway, that's what was going on there. This is typically going to be air leak past a valve getting in there, and it'll typically be an intake valve, because you know you're not going to be pulling oxygen in there from the exhaust side. It's going to cook it like this right here. Now this is, I took this picture one day while I was driving. I saw this 62 Studebaker Lark Sedan driving down the road. I said, I got to take a picture of that. I mean, that's just a cool ride. People, I guess, they find these things in barns and they work on them, they get them going. You know, sometimes back in the day you could get an old car like that just it's been setting up a long time, and a carbureted vehicle, for some strange reason, didn't seem to have the problems with rotten gas that a fuel injected vehicle did. But anyway, this one here, I don't know who owns this thing, but it was really cool looking. I had never seen it after this since this one time. But that is a 62 Studebaker Lark Sedan. Now when you don't have a helper and you're having to do a test on your brake lights or whatever, I used to do this when I was by myself and I was doing a vehicle inspection on a college vehicle. I would put this brake light test stick, I even put a little label on it, brake light test stick on there, so that people could look at that and they could tell what that stick was supposed to be used for, because I had it in one particular drawer in the toolbox. And if you put a stick in there with no label on it, somebody's going to use it for a pry bar and break it. This friend of mine that I still know that runs a school bus shop over here, me and him worked together back in 1977 at a shop here in town. And he did a lot of transmission work, and he had one of those 4-foot 3/8 extensions for getting with the wiggler on them transmission bolts that were hard to get to. And one day he was already as a raising Cane because somebody had taken his 4-inch extension when he wasn't looking and used it for a pry bar and bent it. There was no way on earth you could straighten that out. So as soon as the tool man came, wonder of wonders, the tool man had one on his truck, or he might have had to order one. He had to buy another one of those and just throw that one away. But anyway, people will, if you got more than one people, he didn't have more than one people working out of his toolbox. I don't know who in the world, I did not touch that extension. I wouldn't touch any of his tools. One day I was standing over next to his box because he had a radio mounted on the wall above his box, and I was listening to the Ralph Emery show, something that guy was saying, and I had a extension, 6-inch extension in my 3/8 ratchet, and I was going, yeah, you know, he was swinging around like that. Well, he didn't want nothing like that done with his ratchets, and he came rushing over there and grabbed that ratchet away from me and looked at it to see if it was one of his. That's how particular he is with his tools and everything. But this is my homemade brake light test stick. It's got to be the right length, you know, where it'll go between this is the seat back here, and there's your brake pedal down there. And you basically, when you do that, you look back there at your, you can also do this to keep the brake fluid from going back up into the cylinder when you're squeezing your, you know, pads back up, I mean, when you're retracting your calipers and all. But I usually just let that either draw some fluid out of the master cylinder or just, you know, push them back or whatever. All right, this was a sign I posted over at the college, but it didn't help a whole lot. I went in a lot of trouble to make this. Return each tool to its proper place at the end of each job or at the end of each day. When I was working in my toolbox, now granted I did not have little wrench racks with my wrenches laying on them in my wrench drawer, but I did have my sockets in order, because I don't like having to roll around, you know, pick up sockets and all that. And then if you're, you know, you just throw a bunch of sockets in there and it's a Craftsman set, there's some of them Whitworth sizes in there, like 17/32 that masquerade as something else. But anyway, I just wanted all, let's put them all back where they are, so that when we start work tomorrow, we don't have to come and say, ask the instructor, hey, I can't find a 15mm socket in the toolbox, blah, 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 blah. Don't leave the tools on benches or roll around carts all night. They just wanted to just throw everything down and walk out. And your unused hoses and cords, if you pull air hoses down and there's big loops of air hose up here, you know, it's real easy to trip over that and fall on the concrete, and that's no fun. Keep the spills cleaned up as you work. If you make a spill, it's a good idea, you know, sometimes you're going to have a little bit of a spill, but if you make a spill, it's a really good idea to clean those things up as you work, rather than having all of that stuff hanging over your head to do later. All right, now another sign I posted was whenever I would say, you know, this was the rules, I tried to tell them, but they couldn't remember them, and I put this on the door going into the classroom. If the car is parked inside, at least one window should be down, if possible, and the key should be in the car. So they got, if they can get a window down, they need to roll the window down so you don't get locked out of the car. You know, we've actually been locked out of the car because somebody fooled around and did that. If the car is parked outside, all the windows should be up. The sunroof should be closed as well. and the key should be in the office. Over at the Ford dealer one time, there was somebody that parked a Thunderbird they had worked on out there, and they rolled all the windows up and they locked the doors, but they happened not to notice that the sunroof was open because it was overcast outside. They didn't look up, they didn't think about it, they weren't paying any attention, and they parked that car out there on the service lot, and it rained. And whenever that lady came to get in her car and she sat down in the seat, she sat down in about an inch of water. Oh boy, that was a World War III. She went in the service manager's office throwing a screaming fit and kicked the file cabinet. It was bad news. But anyway, always lock the door when you lower it every time. See, them are crumpy old. These doors were put in there in 1965, and that one needed a paint job. But I said, pull the door all the way down and lock it every single time. Because if you don't, then they're subject to be one left unlocked. Of course, I usually made the rounds before I left, and I would lock the doors, you know, that had been left unlocked and all. But basically, it made it a little easier if I would just tell them go in and lock the door every time. And that would, these are the signs that I like to put up to kind of get the students to cooperate if they pay attention to the sign. The problem is, when you see this sign every day, you get to where you're not reading it anymore, and you just have to take the path of least resistance, which is not to lock the door. Now, I saved old harness connectors for years. Whenever there was an old wire harness, like if I had to replace a wire harness, or I came by, somebody would throw an old wire harness my way, then I would cut the. I was one of these kind of people too, though, that like to have. Sometimes I'd save the whole wire harness if I had somewhere to put it. Although that tends to make a mess, you know. I've seen some mechanics that take a mess with them everywhere they go. But whenever I've got these wires that are a specific color, if there's any way possible, I like to use a wire that exact same color to do the repair. Now that is a pipe dream in some cases, because you're just not going to have every stripe and color and hash that you need. But I do like to have. I like to have little boxes of the connectors that are exactly like what I need if I can find those. And I would take these harness connectors. One day there was this guy that came in. He said somebody, you know, the older Fords back in the 80s had a funky OEM amplifier underneath the package tray back there in the back under the back glass. And it was for the radio. And this guy came and he said somebody stole my amplifier and cut the wires. I don't know why anybody would want one of those amplifiers, because they weren't all that great anyway. But anyway, they cut the wires, stole his amplifier, and here he had these wires just, you know, waggling around there. And he says, I went in the parts room. Now the parts people do not like to look up connectors, although they do have the flip charts for the Delco and the Motorcraft, and you can flip through that and say, this is exactly the connector I need, but you're going to pay $90 for that one connector shell sometimes. But anyway, if I had all of this stuff right here, I saved myself a lot of trouble. Now there's a lot of these you're never going to use, but you never know, see? And so if you found yourself in a bind, and it's either get the car out or wait for you know, they want to sell you the whole harness sometimes, when all you needed was just a little connector shell. And this is a quick repair, gets the vehicle back on the road so you can go on to the next job and all that. Anyway, I took this picture. I had dumped all those connectors out one day and was sorting through them to find one like I needed, and I could usually find one. But this is a picture of that. Now, when I will tell you, when I left the college, I didn't keep those. I left that bucket of connectors there so that they could use them over there. I had collected them at the Ford place, but I added some periodically at the college when we had a wire harness we were getting rid of. It's always a good idea to do this, though. And I had them in a 5-gallon plastic bucket that was under the bench where it, you know, didn't look like a mess all the time. Now, wise circuit testing means that, and I've actually got my my video picture down here covering up this light bulb. But let's say that you got a motor that pulls 5 amps while it's working. The motor won't run, but the power is present at the motor. If you take the motor out, right? Take the motor out, and you've got your power and your ground right here. If you check this with a probe, with a meter, the meter pulls almost no current. You're going to read probably battery voltage there with the switch closed if the fuse is good and all that. Let's say the motor's not running. So you check with this, you're going to see 12 volts. Or you might see 11.5 or something like that. Logic probe, or you hook that one up to the battery, and when you touch hot with it, it's red, and ground with it is green. It pulls almost no current. A low impedance test light pulls about 1/4 of an amp. So if you hook that low impedance test light up from here, and you got your, you know, like that, and it's 0.25. That's not going to be, I can't write good with a mouse, I'm sorry. But anyway, that's not going to be a good test either, because there's not enough current flow there. Because you remember, your motor pulls 5 amps. You got me? Okay, so here we go. Let's get rid of all of that. Alright. Now, so if you go with a headlight bulb, and you can get a pigtail, I actually bought a little assortment of pigtails for headlights at the parts store. You get a pigtail, hook up to this, and you get some wires on it so that you can actually use it to test with. If you turn on this circuit, let's say, and I've actually done this with a fuel pump before, if you turn on this circuit and you've got a headlight bulb in there that pulls about the same amount of current as the motor would, and that headlight won't burn, you've found out why your motor's not working if the motor is good. Now, what I did on the Ranger that I had on one of my videos here is I pulled the doggone pump out because I thought it was a bad pump, because I had power on the ground, and I measured it with a test light like this one right here. Alright, and it had power and ground showing there, so I pulled the pump out on the bench, I powered it up, and it went wing, it ran just like it was supposed to. But when I went back and I powered it up using, I checked that circuit using a headlight bulb, which pulls about the same amount of current as the pump when it's pumping fuel, I wound up finding out that I had a dirty ground. And you can have a bad ground that looks just fine, or a connection problem. So what I did on that one was I ran another ground, that wire, to a place that was easy to get to. You know, you run another ground if you do it in a professional way. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, there are times when this ground will go and feed other stuff, you know, and all that. I should be drawing with green if I'm talking about a ground, right? So it's going to feed other stuff sometimes, but you're basically going to need to be concerned about that if that's not the only place that ground goes. But the long and the short of it is, always use something that will pull as many amps. Now, one of the problems that we have is you've had some of these instructors that have worked for like Freightliner and stuff like that. I've talked about these guys before. There was an old guy named Frank that was working down in the diesel department, and he had been conditioned whenever he's working for Freightliner, after the computers became a prevalent thing on here, never to use a test light on any modern vehicle. He brought his Dodge Caravan up there for me to check the power window that wasn't working, and I used a test light to check it, and I thought he was going to have a stroke, because he thought, oh no, you're going to burn something up. I never in my life burned anything up with a test light. You got to know where to use it, where not to use it. You don't use it to check reference voltage coming from the computer, and some of the older computers were just really weak anyway, and if you use a test light and you test the wrong thing, you might see smoke roll out of the controller. I know some of the older Renaults were like that. But the long and the short of it is, you need to find something. If you go to some of these up and coming nice training events like you see here, there, and yonder nowadays, not a single one of them, and these are real world people that work on all different kinds of cars, I've never seen any of those people tell you not to use a test light. As a matter of fact, they're going to tell you to use, one of them created a box that had 6 tail light bulbs in it so that you could tailor your load by removing, or, you know, and the six bulbs were all wired parallel, so you could take out some of your bulbs if you didn't need to pull as much current and all that kind of stuff. But finding a bad ground requires you to put enough load on the circuit to where you're giving yourself a good test. Learning electrical stuff was something I always enjoyed teaching, because I would have my students get out here and I'd have them wire stuff up. This particular board right here, they got a little juice box down here. This board here had a relay on it, and it had a motor, and it had a light bulb, and it had just a plain old ISO relay epoxy to the board. And what they would do is, there was a switch here, and I told them, I said, I want you to wire this thing up so that when you turn on that switch, it energizes that relay. When the relay is de-energized, I want the light bulb burning. Whenever the relay is energized, I want the light bulb to go out and the motor to run. And that's not a very hard circuit to wire up, but after they did that a few times, they got to where they really understood ISO relays a whole lot better. And that was the thing right here. Now, this right here was a brake booster job on a 2012 Edge. I may have shown you this picture before, but it was a bear, and you know, that, and the brake booster fails on these edges fairly regularly. But you had to pull the intake manifold off of this darn thing to make it work. You know, I mean, to get back there to that booster. And we got the booster swapped out. The lady was really happy, but the booster was just terrible on that thing. All right, now this right here, my son bought a 91 F-150 from my uncle, because my uncle got to where he couldn't see it enough to drive anymore. And the lady that worked up in the office, her husband was a upholstery guy, and he did upholstery in his spare time, and he recovered this seat, and it was absolutely perfect whenever he recovered it. That's when he brought it up there in his pickup truck. And this is what it used to be, and this is what it was when he got through with it. It cost $350, but it was worth every penny of it. He also recovered some other stuff for me, and I really love the work this guy does. This right here is a fairly common cause, a cracked flywheel, because a lot of you guys have probably heard that on an automatic transmission. They've heard this called the flex plate, because every time you apply throttle and the pump starts pumping the fluid into the torque converter expands a little bit, and the flex plate's got to follow it. And so basically you're flexing the plate out and in over and over and over again. What does a piece of metal do when you flex it? It starts to crack and break at the point of flex. So right around this bolt circle, it keeps flexing until it breaks. And that's why cracked flywheels are so prevalent. Now I will tell you this, cracked flywheels are very, very dangerous. And occasionally you'll hear about a cracked flywheel that comes apart, goes ripping through the bell housing, comes through the floor, and kills the person driving the car. A cracked flywheel can be extremely dangerous, and it'll typically be making a tick 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 sound that'll get louder when you put your stethoscope, screw the end off of it, use it for a listening pipe, and stick that up in there in the bell housing area. You'll hear it. And if you can get it inside the bell housing, you'll hear it even better. But I don't know how many cracked flywheels we replaced on all different kind of cars, and it's not just any one car that does it. Now this right here was a Cadillac we worked on, and we had to do some power steering work on. And I don't remember what we had to do, if we had to put a rack on it or what. But General Motors has got this procedure, and I've got a video about bleeding power steering system on there. And they got you pumping the thing with a doggone hand vacuum pump. So this right here is an old a rubber oil filler cap off of an old GM. If I had been thinking clearly, I would have put the part number for it up there. But if you look up that rubber oil filler cap for an old 350, you'll find that. And I made a hole in it, and I put a fitting in there so that I could I put this little bottle right here on it out of the vacuum pump kit, so that you're basically creating low pressure all the way through here. And any fluid that comes out of here will wind up going in that bottle, and it won't go into the engine. Not that it would matter if it did, but it's just one of those things I did. And when I put that vacuum on that thing, and it's pulling that, it's creating low pressure above that fluid, that air, that like foam and all that likes to be trapped down in the steering gear and all that kind of stuff, will come out of there and be purged out of that fluid. On this particular Cadillac, that procedure worked better than anything I've ever seen. Now the first time I ever ran into this was when this lady that had this Impala came over there, and she said, my power steering's making noise, and the Chevrolet place wants to put a power steering pump on it. And I went to another shop, and they want to put a power steering pump, a bunch of pulleys on it. And she says, I want you to look at it. And so I went in and just looked up some technical service bulletins just for the heck of it, because why in the world, if she hadn't really had to have anything done to her power steering, would it just suddenly start making racket? General Motors has a technical service bulletin on this, and they actually have a $60 special tool that works for this. Now the reason on this kind of reservoir, that rubber oil filler cap, and you got to get a brand new one, so it'll be soft and pliable. You can squeeze it in there where it snaps in there, and it makes a perfect seal on that power steering reservoir. When we got through doing this Cadillac, that was the quietest power steering I've ever heard right after a repair was done. It was totally amazing how well that worked. But you can look on my YouTube channel, there is a video about bleeding the power steering. Really, you're supposed to jack the vehicle up so you're not putting a lot of strain on the steering components, turning it back and forth on dry concrete. So go ahead and raise the front of the vehicle up when you're doing that, so you can turn it back and forth and all that, because it's really hard to communicate how much of a strain it's putting on that steering system, having to turn back and forth. If you can have the vehicle rolling when you're parking and you're turning your wheel, you're a whole lot better off that way, because it's not nearly as hard to turn those steering components. But anyway, that's what was going on here. Used to get coffeeed up every morning and get ready for work, and you got to do some ball joints or something like that. You may as well go ahead and get you some coffee. Had some honey over here. I put this little sign that's talking about the automotive department coffee shop. It was really a school thing. There was some chocolate syrup there if somebody wanted that. And I provided free coffee for anybody that wanted it. You know, I wasn't going to put a cup over there and collect money, and it's fine if you want to do that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I just wanted to go ahead. I went ahead and bought the coffee out of my pocket, and I bought the... Now, I did not provide them with styrofoam cups, because if you provide them with styrofoam cups, the cups wind up sitting half full of coffee all over the dadgum shop. I didn't like that. Furthermore, they're going to get spilt, and they can, you know, just... I stopped doing the styrofoam cup thing, right? Okay, so, but I would buy the filters. I'd buy the coffee. The guy from air conditioning and refrigeration used to come over to my apartment every morning, and he would get him a cup of my coffee, even though he had a coffee machine at his place. So I never complained about it. Then he started getting there before I did, and he would make the coffee to suit him, which was a little bit too weak. But anyway, that was, you know, that's one of the reasons I like to have that little coffee, that old Emerson coffee maker I used to have before it burned out, you know. All that. But,
all right, we had
now this starter on this 2007 Tundra is over 5 hours to replace that. You remember the earlier Tundras had it under the manifold. But getting that thing off, you had to pull part of the exhaust off. There was this snake skin and all that junk you had to pull off from under there. And this student that came in and said, my starter don't work. I mean, you know, we found he had a bad starter on there. He don't know how lucky he was, because if you think about that, most of the shops nowadays are charging over $100 an hour for labor. And we didn't charge labor, we just charged part plus 20% plus tax, because it was training. And so whenever we would, we got into there, and the students pulled all that stuff off of there and did a really good job of replacing that starter, but it took them a while. I mean, they managed to do it in 2 or 3 hours. I mean, but it pays 5 hours at the dealership. And if you look it up, the labor time on the one that has the starter mounted on the side, I don't know what the labor time is on the one that's mounted underneath the manifold, but that one's kind of silly too. Although, I would rather see it under the manifold than on the side of the block like this, because it's way harder to get to on this one. But anyway, that's you can see that little video there that I had already played over there. You could rewind and look at that again if you want to. This right here, I started a new program over there at the up at about 35 or 40 miles from the school. And this building was built, you know, for the specific purpose of being a dual enrollment program. And they asked me, can you set this stuff up for me? And they basically wanted me to tell them what they needed, which tools they needed to buy and all that. And he had a huge budget. And so we just bought all kinds of stuff and put in there. And there was rooms to store the tools in. It was a really nice classroom with big, you know, flat panel on the wall for teaching purposes, and it had Android and Windows, and you could draw on it. It was a touch screen. It was really, really nice. But this is actually a shot that was taken in that shop. Now I will say there was only 2 lifts in that shop, and then there was a flat stall over on the other side. But for the amount of time that those students were there, I had to go to this place, and I'd get there about 7 o'clock. The students would show up about 8, and they would be leaving about 10 after 10 on their buses going back to their schools. And they were basically required to stay right there with me. They couldn't just, you know, and they weren't even permitted unless they got special permission to bring their own cars. They basically had to ride the bus over there. But that program is still going, and I got it started, and the enrollment is really massive over there, but it's a huge job for the instructor that has to drive over there and then go over to the main campus or where I used to teach. Now this right here was a fuel pump we put in a Crown Victoria. I mentioned earlier, this little video I was going to show you. Notice it leaking right there. You couldn't tell until you filled it up with, and it got that high.
That is extremely annoying.
In other words, whenever the fuel got above that, it was leaking all around this because there was no seal on that. When it came from CarQuest, they forgot to put a seal on it. There's the part number. And so what we wound up doing, it made us look like a fool. So we had to wound up going and, you know, when we first got done with it, it didn't leak. But then whenever it did leak, it was when they filled it up with gas, and that was a nasty mess because there was gas all over the place and everything like that. So we got another fuel pump from CarQuest and popped it in there. We didn't have no leak on that one. But we had to fill it up with gas when we were done to make sure that it wasn't going to leak again. So that was a whale of a job. Notice on this one here, you have to look pretty close. See that grease on the threads of that power steering pump pulley puller? If you don't put grease on those threads, and I've hammered on this so much talking about here, I have seen them where they would just take that without any grease and try to use that thing to pull the power steering pump pulley off, and it would weld itself together and just ruin everything. But anyway, that's that one right there is being pulled off or whatever. I can't remember. I saw that. Anyway, the B2300 that belonged to the maintenance man, he came and said, my starter's acting up and it's not doing right. And when I raised it up and looked under there, I saw this coolant leak. See that path for coolant, where that coolant has been coming down? And I says, and I looked and it had been dripping all over his starter. And the reason his starter failed was because he had a coolant leak. Now, if you miss that and just pop a starter on it, they're going to be back and say, hey, I've still got a problem. So what we had was a cause and effect relationship here, where the coolant leak was causing the starter to fail. And so that's what we had to deal with there. So anyway, I hope you guys do really well this week, and I will see y'all next Monday. And that concludes our presentation for today.